Well, good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I come to you every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. or streamed online at saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and videocasts after the fact at my website, briancrombie.com. So, COVID-19 has had obviously a fairly major impact from a public health standpoint, from a social standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, and unquestionably from an economic standpoint. And as we come out of COVID-19, hopefully, governments are going to have to be spending a lot of money. And some people are arguing we should be spending it on more green environmental things than anything else. And coming out smart and green is some of the language. And so one person I wanted to speak with is a professor in engineering, Gail Krantzberg. Is that right? Krantzberg?
Yes,
Gail Krantzberg, engineering and public policy at McMaster University, the university's Walter Booth School of Engineering in Hamilton, who specializes in the Great Lakes and has been very passionate in regards to two issues, maybe more, but two issues that I'm aware of: plastics in the Great Lakes and revitalization of the Great Lakes. So, Professor Krantzberg, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Brian. Hope you're well as well.
I am, thank you. So how did you get to studying the Great Lakes when you're in engineering?
First of all, I'm a scientist by training. I'm in the Faculty of Engineering now to teach engineers and scientists how to put their minds towards public policy. But I was a scientist researching Great Lakes revitalization. In the late 80s, there was a call on the governments of Canada and the United States to clean up these particularly degraded locations around the Great Lakes, like Toronto, Hamilton Harbour, places all around the Great Lakes. And I happened to be studying contaminated sediment. And contaminated sediment happens everywhere around the Great Lakes where there's been industrial activity. And cleaning it up is expensive, but it's necessary if you're going to bring the Great Lakes back to health. Once I started working on the Great Lakes, Brian, it's such a magnificent place. It is seen from outer space, these jewels on the face of the planet. I just got hooked on it and wanted to dedicate the rest of my career to making the lakes great.
Fantastic. And so one of the issues you're very passionate about, I understand, is plastics, plastic bottles or all types of plastic, and how they're negatively impacting the Great Lakes?
Absolutely. In the last decade or so, researchers around the region have been finding plastics, microplastics in particular, in the Great Lakes in numbers just as big as the ocean gyres. And everybody's probably familiar with these big plastic whorls in the middle of the ocean. Well, we have it in the Great Lakes. And they're extremely dangerous because, first of all, or small animals, small floating animals will eat it thinking it's nutrients, and they fill up themselves with plastics, and then a fish comes along and eats that piece of plasticized animal, and it gets malnutritioned. And the amount of waste, the sheer amount of plastic waste that gets in the Great Lakes is astonishing. And finding out what it's doing to the ecosystem, what it might be doing to our health, and how to stop it has become a very important point of research for the Great Lakes community.
And I apologize, is this, you say microplastics, so this isn't plastic bottles, this isn't plastic bags, this is plastics that are in the sewage system?
It actually comes from many places. It can start off as plastic bottles. In fact, an astonishing thing, a very disturbing thing to me as I was doing this research is to find out that 70% of the plastics that we properly put in our blue bin gets sent into landfill because our blue bins are contaminated. Once they're in landfill, those plastic bags can fly around and find their way into the streams, into the rivers, into our sewage systems, and into the Great Lakes, and break down over time to smaller and smaller and smaller particles. About a year ago this time, I was in a park in Etobicoke at the outfall of a storm sewer that actually carries overflow of sewage as well. And the plastics littered the entire beachfront, from small pieces all the way up to syringes, all the way to very colorful little specks. And that's what our animals are ingesting. And worse than that, plastics attract certain types of pollutants that are cancer-causing pollutants. So they're filling their gut with poisons in the form of nutrient-deficient plastics, and also with poisons that are carcinogenic. So this is a very massive issue.
And the second issue that I understand you're interested in is revitalization of the Great Lakes. Tell me about that, please.
Well, you started off your show talking about COVID and talking about, what is the future for our economy? And people have this notion that in a time of economic distress, that investing in environmental improvement is a luxury, but it's not. A few authors and myself looked at these locations around the Great Lakes that were particularly degraded and where a lot of money was spent to bring them back to health. Close to $2 billion in Hamilton Harbour, for example. More than that in the Toronto region for sewage infrastructure. And think about it. If you're living on a lakefront community and you look out into the water and it's green and it's putrid and it smells and it's ugly, you're not going to want to live there, and property values are going to be very low. What we found was when you stimulate the economy by giving people jobs to clean up the Great Lakes, you actually boost the economy by property values going up, businesses wanting to locate there, people wanting to fish there again, tourism opening up. So it's a big economic boon to the region to invest in environmental excellence. It's also, when you create habitat for fish and wildlife, it gives people an opportunity to get back into nature, like we all have to do now as we get over the COVID isolation. Get out into nature, enjoy the spectacular beauty of birds and the fish and the wildlife that are now coming back into health because we've invested in revitalizing the excellence that is the Great Lakes.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Krantzberg, Gail Krantzberg, who teaches engineering at McMaster School of Engineering. She teaches engineering and public policy, and we're talking about plastics in the Great Lake, and we're talking about revitalization of the Great Lakes. We're going to take a break for some messages. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting about the Great Lakes with Professor Gail Krantzberg, who is from the School of Engineering at McMaster University. The school at McMaster is called McMaster's Walter Booth School of Engineering, and she's a professor in engineering and public policy. Professor Krantzberg, I never heard about public policy for engineers. Why are engineers worried about public policy?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you. A lot of public policy is done as a response to public perception of need. And governments will look at finances, look at equity, and try and do the best they can to satisfy that perception. But without a technical background, an engineering background, and a science background, a fact-based policies can be flawed. Engineers and scientists have a lot to offer in terms of what is possible, what can be done. What engineers and scientists don't really understand is all of the factors that go into policymakers' decision. But one of the most important factors is a consideration of the technical feasibility of a policy and the technical opportunities and innovation that could inform public policy. And that's why we want our engineering and science students to learn the policy process and inform policymakers about sound decisions that will benefit society.
So we are going to be spending a fair amount of money in government coming out of COVID-19. I think we're going to have to try to stimulate the economy. I've interviewed Andrea Horvath of the NDP in Ontario and Elizabeth May of the Green Party nationally, and both of them were really focused on spending that money in green ways to try to spend the money environmentally friendly. And I interviewed Aaron O'Toole. This was before he became leader of the Conservative Party, but when he was a candidate for the Conservative Party, and he's now leader of the Conservative Party. And he's come out very strongly saying governments can't choose winners and losers, and so therefore the fiscal stimulus that we should be providing should be to everybody, whether they're an oil company or a green energy company. What's your attitude?
Well, there's validity there, but there's no reason that an oil industry can't come up with green, innovative ways of transitioning to how they're behaving now to what they will do in the future. If you look at the oil sands and the Athabasca River, the strides that have been made by industry to get their job cleaned up, to use less water and pollute less is really remarkable. We are the consumers. We are the ones who want oil. So let's not put the blame on the oil industry for what the consumer is demanding, but let's invest in it in a green way. And let's transition our energy into more renewable energy where we can. So I think equity is a very important thing. But we were talking earlier about investing in environmental cleanup. That's a job creator, and that stimulates economy, and all sorts of sectors benefit, not just the fish. But businesses and industries who locate here will have people who want to stay here because of its beauty. So I think green infrastructure is a wise thing. Reducing greenhouse gases is a wise thing. And in getting investment into industries that are typically greenhouse gas emitters to try and find out ways of doing it better, to be innovative, that's something I think the government should be investing in.
Okay, so let's go back to one of the other examples. You were talking about cleaning up, Lake Ontario, the Great Lakes, but Lake Ontario, and that it would benefit property owners that are on the lake, which, is pretty obvious. The problem is that we can't capture that value. That value is captured by the property owner. If we put up a transit stop, sometimes we can have a tax increment financing. We can capture some of that value increment. Are you suggesting maybe we should be taxing people with lakefront property if we clean up the lake?
What I'm saying is, as property values go up, so does the taxation on the property. I mean, if the property value has increased, the percent that goes into municipal revenue also increases, and I think that's fair. And I think that's one of the reasons we've seen, even in the lovely town of Collingwood, there was a polluted harbor there. And property taxes, since the revitalization of the harbor have begun, there's a redevelopment of a mixed commercial residential place that creates revenue for the municipality to create jobs for people who live there. So I think that's a very valid way of generating revenue for municipality.
You quoted $2 billion in Hamilton Harbour. Is that the correct number?
That's at least. And there's a lot of infrastructure upgrades for wastewater treatment plants. There's been hundreds of millions put into habitat restoration. Look, Hamilton Harbour was considered the most polluted place on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes. And now there's bald eagle nesting there and reproducing there. That's a major success story. So that's the return on investment that's almost not quantifiable. And
have property values along Hamilton Harbour gone up?
Absolutely, they have, particularly on the North Shore in areas that there still is an industrial footprint where the steel mills are. Property values have not changed there, but other property values have increased, and the benefits to all orders of government are therefore reflected in that.
These landfills that we seem to be putting in and abutting into the Lake Ontario. I'm not sure if it's in other lakes, but certainly Lake Ontario in numerous different places. Are these helpful or harmful to Lake Ontario?
Landfills are a very tricky thing. If they're engineered right and managed and operated properly, they're stable. But typically what we find, particularly with landfills over time, is that they leach chemicals into the groundwater, and that can seep into the lake. So that's not a good thing. If they're near the shore and they're seeping into the lake, they may seep into a wetland, which is the biological engine of the lake. That's where the fish and wildlife like to grow and reproduce, and that's not a good thing. If we could divert properly from landfill, we would solve so many problems. We talked about plastics in landfill a little while ago. I'm not saying plastics are the devil. I'm not saying plastics are bad. Look, if you wanted to ship a bunch of drinking containers on a truck and it's in plastic bottles, it weighs a lot less than glass bottles, so it's using less greenhouse gases to move around. The problem is the end of life. We don't capture it, we don't collect it, we don't reuse it, we don't repurpose it, we throw it into the landfill, and boom, it goes into the lake.
What about this landfill that's actually built right into the lake, like Sir Samuel Park, or down the bottom of Etobicoke, etc.?
So those need to be monitored in the way that the province has given them a license to operate. So it's really up to the province, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, to ensure those licenses are being respected and that these landfills are not leaching. When we do find them leaching, it is treatable. You can collect the leachate and treat it so that it's not toxic. We saw that in Niagara River a long time ago. But in some cases, that treatment is for decades and decades and decades. So it's wise for us to try and move away from landfills, recapture our waste to a circular economy where a waste becomes a product rather than refuse. You don't see that in nature. Nothing goes into wasteland in nature. So when something dies or something no longer has a life, it decomposes and becomes food for something else. That's what a circular economy should be, and we should be pushing everyone to move away from disposable products, move away from the landfills. But for now, yeah, they will be necessary. People do not like the notion of incinerating our garbage. There is something called energy from waste. So if you burn waste and you capture the energy, you can power homes with that. But still, there's the concern, well, what's being emitted from the smokestacks? Today's incinerators are much, much cleaner than in the past. The trick with that is if we start relying on those incinerators for our waste, there's no incentive to get away from waste. So the waste issue is a very complicated one, but the hierarchy that looks at recapture, reuse, repurpose, and refuse is really the way to get off of the landfill train that we're on right now.
I understand you released a major research study in November of 2019. What was it all about?
So that was looking, again, it was a summary, it was an overview of all the research that has been done in the Great Lakes looking at plastic pollution there. And where it's found, it's coming out of our wastewater treatment plants. So there's something called a very high-grade treatment plant, which is a tertiary plant. They're fine. But we have a lot of what are called secondary, so they're not as advanced. And you find these small pieces of plastic coming out of those plants when we wash our clothes and it comes off our fibers, for example. When we use personal products that have little bits of plastic in them to exfoliate our faces, that gets washed out. The good news is those microbeads in cosmetic products have been banned by the Canadian government. They're still probably out there on the shelf. But the study really highlighted the very diverse sources of this plastic. And the problem is once it's in the lake, it's very, very hard to get rid of. We can get rid of the chunky stuff, the bottles and plastic bags. But once it breaks down into microfibers and then even into nanoparticles, really tiny particles, it's nearly impossible to get out of the lakes. And it'll be there for 10 years, 100 years before the lakes ever recover from it.
I read about this Australian company that manufactured some machine called Seabins that vacuums up plastics from the oceans. Have you ever heard of that? Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. There's a number of organizations here in Ontario who are testing that right now. They're trying to test it particularly in marinas because they're enclosed spaces, but also there's discharge from vessels using the waterways as boathouses, if you will. So the Council for the Great Lakes Region and Pollution Probe and others are installing them now. Those Seabins, they spin the water and funnel out the plastics to be put into the garbage receptacles. And we're testing it now. It's brand new in the Great Lakes, but it's a very encouraging and promising innovation.
I used to live right near the lake in Lake Ontario, and it smelled, and you didn't want to. You felt frankly unsafe going swimming in the lake. I didn't think that was from plastics. I thought that was from sewage or from overflow from drainage, etc. What's the biggest problem in the Great Lakes right now from a pollution standpoint?
Well, what you just mentioned is still going on. I was at Mary Curtis Park, and I could have been in any other park, and one of the pipes that came out carried an overflow. When there's a huge storm, there's too much sewage and stormwater to go to the sewage treatment plant, so they have to overflow that. And I'm standing on the pier, and a big belch of black-gray water went out, and it smelled. And that's raw sewage. So what you smelled, it's still going on, not nearly as badly as in the past. So we've really controlled nutrients. But what we have not controlled, so there's a few things. It's a very hard question to answer. One is, we've seen what's going on with Lake Erie. It's regressing to the way it was in the 1960s. Slimy green algae that create toxic drinking water, could make your dogs ill, if not die, from drinking it with cyanobacteria, blue-green bacteria. A lot of that is because of agricultural runoff and climate change. So we have these major storms. We've seen them in Mississauga, where completely washed out the south part of Cawthra, for example, south of where I live. And those major storms carry with them a lot of excess nutrients on agricultural land, and that is like over-fertilizing the lake, and you get these massive algal blooms. That's starting again, and it's exacerbated because of climate change means that the climate that has changed here now means more frequent severe storms. So climate change, nutrient enrichment, plastic pollution, and then there's the ever-present danger of species that don't belong here that get into the lakes called alien invasive species. We're looking at them right now. Some of your listeners may know about Asian carp that are from Asia. They were brought into the south of the United States to control a disease. They got out, they're up the Mississippi, up the Illinois River. They're knocking at the door in Chicago, and if they get into our Great Lakes, they can become the only fish just about in the Great Lakes. And there goes a $7 to $8 billion recreational fishing annually if that Asian carp gets into the Great Lakes. So invasive species is another really tricky one.
So how would you stop the Asian carp?
So there's a number of ways. One is to actually separate what's called the shipping canal, the Chicago Sanitary Shipping Canal, from Lake Michigan. And if you have ships coming up the Illinois River from the Mississippi and they want to put their cargo into the Great Lakes, you just transfer the cargo over a berm into a lake ship, a Great Lakes ship, and off it goes, rather than opening that channel and allowing that channel to fail. There are electric barriers there right now that repel the Asian carp. They don't like the electric barriers. There's bubble barriers, there's acoustic barriers, but it's all man-made and it's not fail-safe. Fail-safe is to totally separate the rivers, because actually they were separated a long time ago, over a century ago, and now we have shipping going up and down. We don't need that for commerce. The shipping industry is not excited about this because just-on-time delivery is very important economically, but I think with smart engineers and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Natural Resources in Michigan, that we could find a solution to stop them from coming into the Great Lakes, because it's a massive threat to the integrity, biodiversity, the fish well-being in the Great Lakes.
What other invasive species are you worried about?
Well, there's invasive species that destroy our forests, right? Look at what happened to our beautiful ash forests. So emerald ash borer came in through cargo also, but through the crates, through the wooden crates. So inspecting everything that comes off a ship that comes from overseas is really important to protect not just our aquatic systems, but also our forests. The beautiful Rattray Marsh just down the road from us in Mississauga was 30 to 40% elm, ash, I should say, sorry. And that's all gone. And you walk there and you see all the felled trees, and it's a devastating effect. That if we are cautious about what we bring and where we bring it in from, we can slow the import or maybe even stop the import. But right now the door is open to other invasive species coming in and disrupting our food webs. What if the next invasive species turns out to be a human pathogen? Then I think governments would take a lot more progressive action than being cautious. It would become a massive threat. With the pandemic around us, perhaps it's a warning to all of us to be careful what we import and how we bring it in, what vessels it comes in, how it gets here, how it's inspected, so that we don't get another massive tragedy like our ash forests.
What's the solution to the sewage overflow and the wastewater overflow into the lake? Is it just big reservoirs for too much rain, too much storm?
So coming back to the point of green infrastructure, we have a lot of paved surfaces. We pave over everything. You know, thinking of a Joni Mitchell song there just now, but if we allow the rain to get back into the ground, if we used our parking lots as porous pavers, there's such a thing that, yeah, you can park your car on it, but when it rains, the rain actually goes down into the ground, goes into the groundwater. That's not going to solve all the problems, but if you have bioswales, or you have, which is sort of like a green footprint around a parking lot that absorbs the water before it just rushes off into a sewer, you can slow down the spread of that. You can slow down that stormwater and capture it for use. If you capture it off your roof and put it in a cistern, you now have free water for irrigation. That is a very big way of improving, but there will still be a need for bigger infrastructure, larger detention tanks, larger catchments, so that we capture the stormwater and keep it contained before it has the ability to overflow our wastewater plants or overflow our combined sewers. So it's technical engineering, but it's also soft green engineering, and I think it needs both.
What's the solution with plastics? Should we be outline plastic bottles, or should we be putting a big deposit on it like on plastic bags, or what should we be doing?
I wish I had all the answers for that. I think plastic bottles are here to stay. They have a good purpose. They serve a good purpose. But I think your idea of a deposit return on plastic bottles would make people think about returning it. There's something called extended producer's responsibility. So the manufacturers of plastic products should have some responsibility for getting it back and then reusing it or turning it into a new product. The move towards a ban on plastic grocery bags was a great start. Now with COVID and everybody's terrified of you can't bring in your own cloth bags, there's a regression there, but I still think we should be paying for those. So first we can refuse them, but we could return them and get reimbursed in some way. So the manufacturer should have some responsibility for recapturing the waste at the end of its life, turning it into something new with a new life cycle. I have a lanyard, like when you go to conferences and you get those name tags, it's made completely out of recycled plastics. Roots makes clothing out of completely recycled plastics. So there's a market if we're smart about it and we want to be innovative about it. The plastics industry is not the culprit, but the plastics industry has an opportunity here to have a leadership role saying, give us back the plastic at the end of your life. We're going to do something more with it and repurpose it and reuse it and upscale it into something different. I think it'll take some time, but I think it's something that's solvable. Engineers are smart. Government policymakers are very smart. If you put the two together, and industry, I think there's a possible way out of this.
If I was Prime Minister of Canada and I made you the czar of the Great Lakes and said, do what you want to do over the course of the next 10 years to make the Great Lakes beautiful again, make America great again. Oh my God, did I almost say that? Make the Great Lakes beautiful again. What would you do? What's your vision?
So it would be figuring out how to govern this place better. We have two national, so on the Great Lakes, you have Canada and the United States. You have 8 Great Lakes states, you have 2 provinces. So you can't clean up the Great Lakes on one side. It has to be a coordinated binational effort. But then we've got hundreds of indigenous communities on both sides of the border and hundreds of municipalities. And then there's industry and business and academia. We need a much more collaborative, integrated approach towards pooling resources. What is the best? Let's preserve the best. Let's take care of the worst first. So those 2 priorities, what's the biggest threat? Let's get onto that threat and tackle it in a collaborative way, binationally, with our First Nations, with our Métis, with our tribes, with our municipalities, and come up with a way of being accountable to the people of Canada and the United States, but to the people of Canada, that we are stewards of this place, which is a globally significant place. We're talking about at least hundreds of millions, if not billions annually that would need to be spent. Infrastructure upgrades, green infrastructure upgrades, adaptation to climate change. Climate is here. Do everything that you want to reduce greenhouse gases, but the climate has changed here. How are we going to adapt? How are we going to make our communities resilient? Figure that one out. Stop plastics in their track and look at what emerging threats there are on the horizon, like warfare, like poisoning water bodies, like nuclear disasters. What are some of the emerging threats? And let's get some good minds thinking about how we could prepare for the unknown so that we have a rapid response to it.
Professor Gail Krantzberg, is that right? Krantzberg? I apologize. Of the School of Engineering in McMaster University, of both engineering and public policy. Thank you so much for joining us and talking about plastics, revitalization of the Great Lakes, and how important the Great Lakes are to all of us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for covering this. It's time to make the lakes great.
It's time to make the Great Lakes great again.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us. Just take a break and we're going to come back for some more on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour in just a minute.